Like a silver streak across a midnight sky, our stories move with a speed and a brilliance that you will never forget. Experience high-octane drama and the thrill of a narrative that never slows down for anyone. Click subscribe now and catch the streak before it's gone. I didn't say a word when my son-in-law called me a relic. I didn't flinch when he said it at the dinner table. Right in front of my daughter. Right in front of the grandkids. I just set down my fork, folded my napkin, and looked at him the way I used to look at junior engineers who submitted sloppy work. He didn't understand that look. He never did. My name is Walter. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer, and before I retired, I owned and managed 4 residential properties in addition to the house I lived in. I drove a 2009 Ford F-150 with a cracked side mirror and a hitch I used every other weekend. I wore the same brand of flannel shirts I'd been buying since 1994. I got my hair cut at a barber shop that charged $14 and had a jar of blue barbicide on the counter that looked older than my grandchildren. My son-in-law Derek drove a leased BMW and had an opinion about everything. He'd been married to my daughter Claire for 6 years. He worked in marketing. He talked about brand presence and personal optics more than any human being I had ever encountered. From the very beginning, I could see how he looked at me. Like I was a problem that hadn't been solved yet. Claire was my only child. After her mother passed 8 years ago, it was just the two of us for a long time. She was sharp, kind, and she worked hard. She became a pediatric nurse. She was the best thing I ever had a hand in building. But she loved Derek, and I respected that. I tried to keep my observations to myself. I came to dinner. I fixed things when they needed fixing. I stayed in my lane. The house where Derek and Claire lived with their 2 kids, my grandchildren, Nora and James, was a house I'd built equity in over 20 years. After Linda passed, I transferred the deed into a family trust I set up with my attorney. Claire was the beneficiary. They lived there. I covered the property taxes and the insurance. Derek knew the house wasn't his. He just acted like he'd forgotten. What changed everything started on a Sunday in October. I'd driven over to help James with a science project. He was 9 and obsessed with bridges, which I loved, because bridges were the first thing I'd ever designed. We were at the kitchen table with popsicle sticks and wood glue when Derek came in and stood at the edge of the room with his arms crossed. He watched us for a moment, the way you watch something you're about to interrupt. "Walter," he said, "Claire and I need to talk to you about something. When you're done." I finished the bridge support with James, told him to let it dry overnight, and went to the living room. Claire was sitting on the couch. She looked tired. Derek stood near the fireplace like he was chairing a meeting. He told me they needed more space, that his parents Doug and Pamela were struggling. Doug had a bad knee, and Pamela had been having memory issues, early stage. Nothing severe, but they needed more support. Derek said it made sense for them to move in. He said the kids loved having grandparents close. He said it would bring the family together. I looked at Claire. She looked at the carpet. I asked where exactly they planned to put his parents. Derek said the in-law suite. The one off the garage. The one I had built myself in 2003, with the intention that my own mother might use it someday. She passed before she ever could. I told him that sounded like a real thoughtful plan, and I asked what he had in mind for me. That was when he said it. He said there were some very nice 55-plus communities in the county. Active, he called them. He said I'd have more freedom. He said I'd be around people my own age. He said I was clearly independent and healthy, and I'd probably thrive. He was recommending I move out of a home I owned so that his parents could move in. I kept my face completely still. I asked if he'd looked into any of these communities specifically. He said he had. He had printed brochures. He actually had printed brochures in a folder on the coffee table. I picked one up. It had a photograph of 2 white-haired people playing pickleball. I told them I appreciated them thinking of me. I drove home, poured a glass of bourbon, and sat at my kitchen table until 11 o'clock that night. Now, let me tell you something I didn't say to Derek that afternoon. something I'd never said to anyone except my attorney and my accountant. I had spent the years after Linda died doing two things: grieving and quietly building. The 4 rental properties I owned were fully paid off. The house in the trust had no mortgage. I had investments that Linda and I had started in our 30s and that I had continued to grow carefully and without fanfare. I was not wealthy in the way people on television are wealthy, but I was more than comfortable. I was, by any reasonable measure, financially free. Derek thought I was a retired old man in a flannel shirt who needed to be handled. He had made a category error. I called my attorney, a woman named Sandra, the following Monday morning. I told her what Derek had proposed. She listened without interrupting, which was why I'd used her for 20 years. When I finished, she said, "Walter, what do you want to do?" I thought about it for a moment. Then I told her. Over the next several weeks, I said nothing to Derek or Claire. I came to Sunday dinners. I helped Nora with her reading and James with his bridge, which had won 2nd place in the school project fair, and he was not over it. I fixed a gutter that had come loose on the north side of the house. I acted exactly like I always acted. Derek, interpreting my silence as agreement, had apparently moved ahead. Claire called me in mid-November and told me, gently, with a voice I could tell she'd rehearsed, that Doug and Pamela were planning to move in after the first of the year. She said they'd started talking to a 55-plus community called Meadow Glen about availability for me. She said it was really lovely. She said they had a woodworking shop. I told her that was very kind. I asked how she was doing. She said she was fine. She sounded like she was convincing herself. Doug and Pamela arrived on January 9th. I know because Claire sent me a photo. Pamela was smiling in front of the in-law suite. Doug had his arm around Derek. Everyone looked very pleased with an arrangement that had been made without the person whose name was on the trust documents. I sent back a heart emoji and kept moving. Sandra had been busy. We had restructured the trust language and executed a long-term lease agreement with a property management company for the main house, effective March 1st. The lease was binding, fully legal, and had been drafted with every relevant county ordinance accounted for. The terms were straightforward. The property management company would be the point of contact for any occupants. The occupants would have 60 days to vacate if they were not party to the lease agreement. They were not party to the lease agreement. I also made sure Doug and Pamela weren't named in anything. This wasn't their fault. They were just old people whose son had told them they were moving in with family. They were collateral to a problem Derek had created. The letter went out on February 15th. I was at the hardware store when Claire called me. I was looking at paint samples, which I found oddly calming. Her number came up and I answered on the second ring. She didn't say hello. She said, "Dad, what is this letter?" I asked her which letter. She told me. A property management company. A lease. A 60-day notice. What was this? What was happening? Dad. I told her I could come over if she wanted to talk in person. There was a silence. Then she said yes. I drove over that evening. Derek was waiting in the living room the way he'd been waiting in October, arms crossed, jaw tight, standing near the fireplace. Doug and Pamela were in the in-law suite. Claire was on the couch again. She looked less tired this time and more frightened, which I didn't like. Claire should never look frightened. I sat down in the armchair across from them, the same armchair I'd been sitting in since before they were married. I'd reupholstered it myself in 2011. Derek started. He said this was ridiculous. He said I was punishing them. He said this was petty. He said he couldn't believe I would do something like this to Claire, to his kids, to his parents who had already moved their whole lives. He said I was being vindictive and childish, and frankly, he'd always suspected I had control issues, and this proved it. I let him finish. He took a while. Then I spoke. I kept my voice the same way I'd kept my face in October. Completely level. I asked him if he remembered the conversation we'd had in this room 4 months ago. He said he did. I asked him if he had ever asked me whether I was willing to leave. He started to answer, and I held up one hand, just slightly, and he stopped. I said, "You did not ask me. You told me. You had brochures. You had a timeline. You had already decided what was going to happen to the home that I own, and you did not ask me one single question about what I wanted. I was the problem you had already solved. He said it wasn't like that. I said it was exactly like that. I said I had no anger about it, which was mostly true. I said I had simply made my own decisions about my own property, which I had every legal right to do. Claire said quietly, "Dad, where are we supposed to go?" That question hit me differently than Derek's speech had. Because that was my daughter. That was the little girl who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long drives. I looked at her for a moment before I answered. I told her that the property management company had my contact information. I told her that the lease terms could be discussed and that there were options. I told her that if she and I sat down, together, as adults, and had the honest conversation that we probably should have had in October, then we could figure something out. I told her I loved her, and I was not trying to hurt her or the kids. Then I looked at Derek and I said, "But that conversation will not include the assumption that I am a problem to be managed. It will not include me being asked to leave my own house on a timeline someone else has decided. And it will not include me being spoken to the way you have spoken to me in this room tonight." Derek didn't say anything. Claire said she needed some time. I told her I understood. I stood up, put on my jacket, and walked to the door. Before I left, I stopped in the hallway where Nora and James had both appeared at the top of the stairs, clearly having heard everything and trying to look like they hadn't. I told them I loved them. I told James his bridge really should have gotten first place. He almost smiled. I drove home. I poured a smaller glass of bourbon than last time. Over the following 2 weeks, Claire called me 4 times. The first call was short and tense. The second one was longer. The third one, she cried. I let her. I didn't try to fix it immediately, the way I used to fix things. Just hand her a solution and move on. I listened. She told me that she had known, somewhere, that what Derek had done wasn't right, that she'd been uncomfortable with the brochures, that she hadn't been able to say anything because Doug and Pamela were already so excited, that she felt like she was failing everyone at once. I told her she wasn't failing anyone. I told her the only person who had done something wrong in this situation was the person who had made arrangements with other people's property without asking. She didn't defend Derek this time. By the 4th call, we had started to work through it. Claire and I agreed to meet with Sandra to go over the actual trust documents, which Claire had never read in full. When she saw them, she was quiet for a long moment. She asked me why I had never told her any of this. I told her I hadn't wanted her to feel like I was holding anything over her. She said she wished she'd known. I told her I wished I'd told her. That was true. Derek took considerably longer. He wasn't used to being the person who had been wrong. I didn't push it. That wasn't my job. My job was my daughter and my grandchildren. Derek would either figure himself out or he wouldn't. I'd seen men like him before. Some of them came around. Some of them didn't. Either way, the property was still in the trust, and my attorney still had very good handwriting. Doug and Pamela were the part that required the most delicacy. They were good people who had been put in a bad situation by their son's planning. I called Doug directly in late February. He'd been a machinist for 30 years. He was a straight-ahead kind of man. I told him I had no issue with him personally. I told him what had happened from my side. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said he'd had a feeling something was off but hadn't known what. He apologized. I told him he didn't owe me an apology. His son did. But I appreciated it. Eventually, a workable solution emerged. Not the one Derek had designed, which required me to disappear, but a real one. Claire and I restructuring send. The trust to include a formal family agreement reviewed by Sandra that laid out how the property would be used, who had what responsibilities, and what the process would be for any major decisions going forward. Doug and Pamela stayed in the in-law suite under a proper arrangement that included their names and their rights. I stayed in the main house. Nobody moved to Meadow Glen. Derek spent about 3 weeks being cold and deliberate, which I found I could tolerate without difficulty. He eventually came to me one Saturday morning when I was in the driveway working on the truck. He stood there for a moment. not saying anything. I kept working. He said he guessed he'd made some assumptions. I handed him a wrench and pointed at the other side of the engine, and he stood there and helped me without saying anything else for about 40 minutes. That was as close to an apology as Derek was built for. I decided it was enough. There were things that didn't get repaired quickly, and I tried to be honest with myself about them. The relationship between Claire and Derek had some visible cracks that neither of them wanted to look at directly yet. My relationship with Claire was better than it had been in years. Actually, the kind of better that sometimes comes from going through something difficult together instead of just being polite to each other on holidays. That part I was grateful for. What I thought about most, in the evenings, sitting in that reupholstered armchair with a book I was only half reading, was how easy it had been for Derek to look at me and see something dismissible. A flannel shirt, an old truck, a quiet retirement. He'd stacked his assumptions up and built a whole plan on top of them, confident they were solid. I thought about the brochures on the coffee table. He had been so sure. The thing about spending 31 years in structural engineering is that you develop a specific and lasting respect for what holds things up. Not just the visible frame, but the load-bearing elements people don't bother to look for because they're out of sight. Foundations. Transfers. The parts that were put in place quietly, years ago, that everything else rests on without knowing it. Derek had looked at me and seen an old man in a flannel shirt. He had not thought to check the foundation. I'm not a man who enjoys conflict. I'm not a man who wanted this situation or engineered it out of spite. What I am is a man who spent decades building things carefully and legally, and without advertising it. Because I learned early that the loudest thing in the room is rarely the strongest. I'm a man who loves his daughter and would do almost anything for her, except disappear on someone else's schedule. I'll be 68 in April. I have a truck I'm still working on. Grandchildren who argue about board games with a seriousness I find deeply admirable. And a daughter who calls me now on Tuesday evenings just to talk, not because something is wrong. I still get my hair cut at the same barber shop. Still $14. The barbicide is the same jar. I don't have any interest in people knowing what I have or what I've built. The only time that ever becomes relevant is when someone decides it doesn't exist.